there's no way I was eating fewer than 200 grams of sugar a day. I mean, I just ate everything that was in front of me. I would drink 2 liters of orange juice as my snack box. Other kids were drinking little juice boxes. I had a 2-liter can of orange juice. When I consume fructose, which I do all the time, it's generally in the form of fruit. I don't restrict my consumption of fruit.
I'm excited to announce that we have another convert into the bioenergetic space. And this is a famous low carber. His name is Dr. Peter Attia, who admits to eating fructose all the time. Now in this video, we're going to talk about a podcast that Peter Attia has done, and we're going to discuss whether or not fructose is a poison. We'll talk about the effects of sugar on satiety and whether a high sugar diet is congruent with health. So let's jump into a clip from this podcast and we'll start to break everything down.
It's emotional. It's sort of nonsensical. Right? What we should really be asking, I think, is a question that's more along the lines of, what are the biochemical effects of sucrose or high fructose corn syrup or fructose in general at different doses and under different metabolic conditions? And understandably, that's a mouthful that nobody wants to say. So it's just easier to just say sugar is poison. But again, I think this is an area where my view has changed quite a bit. And it's changed because of the data, right? I just don't see the data to demonstrate that an isocaloric substitution of fructose for glucose is demonstrably worse for health outcomes if total energy intake is preserved.
Okay, so that's quite a revelation from Dr. Peter Attia. And I want to start off with saying I respect his change in perspective and being cognitively flexible enough to adjust his take with looking at the data. I think that's what we all should be doing overall. So that's great that he's able to do that and publicly state that. The next thing is, I agree. I think it's true that the data doesn't support a demonstrably negative health outcomes for fructose consumption in isocaloric feeding trials, where basically their calories are kept the same and they just switch glucose for fructose or something along these lines. Now, some of the studies where we do see negative effects, I've talked about in the past, they've been set up in a way which would be very difficult to replicate under normal circumstances. So I don't think those are very helpful for us to understand what's going on in a normal diet. But the other thing I want to mention here is, this is just looking at free fructose. If we take into consideration fruits and juices, I think at the worst, we would see no negative effect of fruits and juices if they were doing isocaloric feeding trials where the calories are kept the same. And if anything, it would be better because of the other benefits that come with fruits and juices, which would be the vitamins and minerals, the polyphenolic compounds, and the fibers. Now, isolated fructose by itself does indeed have some negative effects in the studies, and these are important to know, and this is something that I've talked about in the past, and I've talked about on the Energy Balance podcast. But basically, when you don't have enough glucose present with the fructose, if you just have fructose by itself, the fructose isn't absorbed in the intestine, and then the bacteria are able to get a hold of the fructose and produce toxins from it, and then that goes to the liver, and that can cause metabolic problems in and of itself. Free fructose and even free glucose or sucrose, which is a combination of glucose and fructose together, bonded together, they don't have vitamins, they don't have minerals, so you would be lacking that if in the case of free source versus if you're having fruit. There's no polyphenolic compounds, and there's also a lack of fiber, which will help shift the microbiome. So overall, the general effects of free fructose and glucose by itself, I wouldn't say are ideal to use as a main calorie source or carbohydrate source. I would look to use tubers, fruits, juices, things like this. And I think the data, if they were using those, would be quite a bit different overall. Now, the next thing I want to point out here with the fructose and free fructose, and this isn't even in the trials, but this is in normal free living settings, is most sources of sucrose or high fructose corn syrup are coming from ultra processed foods, are laden with heated polyunsaturated fatty acids, industrial additives, and these can disturb the microbiome, create micronutrient deficiencies, and also can lead to overeating particular fat. So what I want to do is I want to jump into Chronometer really quickly here to show this and show, what the difference would be just from a micronutrient intake level when we look at fruit juices and fruits versus eating what people typically consider high sugar sources. So let's do that really quick here. So when we come over here, I put a couple different high sugar sources in Chronometer, and basically it's the same for meals. These would be to hit ideally at 300 grams of carbs a day, which was just the macros that I had set up in this chronometer day. And basically what you see, the source here would be Chips Ahoy, Oreos, crumb cake, and Coke. And basically, if you add 8 ounces of Coke and an ounce of crumb cake, 2 Oreos, and 2 Chips Ahoy with each meal for 4 meals a day, you would hit 300 grams of carbs. But something that's important to keep in mind is you'd also get 65 grams of fat. So a lot of these sugar sources and the ultra-processed sugar sources where we would find high fructose corn syrup, where you'd find sucrose or cane sugar, would just be also high in fat. And also all of these would be high in the different additives that are highly problematic. So when you look at the micronutrient profile, also not really a great micronutrient profile. There's very little vitamins here. Most of the B vitamins that are in these food sources are fortification. So it's just producers adding fortified vitamins and minerals, or adding vitamins and minerals to the product because they are nutrient poor. And that's the same goes for some of the mineral content with these different options as well. Like the iron content here is likely fortified iron, and some of the other components, the sodium is added. Some of the other components may be present because of the wheat flour that they use to make these, but in general, not very nutrient dense. When we come over to fiber, very little fiber in these sources. And when we come over to polyunsaturated fats or fatty acids, we see the polyunsaturated fat intake to get 300 grams of carbs from these high sugar sources is going to be 11.5 grams per day, with 10 grams coming from omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. And again, these are heated to high temperature, so definitely not ideal. Now, in comparison, if we look at a day with fruits, I have 4 meals here. The general setup is using bananas, cantaloupe, orange juice, and then pineapple. And if we put that in here, you don't really get any fats with these fruits. We're hitting the 300 grams of carbs. And what we see is the micronutrient profiles are significantly better without actually having any fortification. So we see that most of the vitamins, almost all the B vitamins are topped off, with the exception of vitamin B12. And then also biotin's not topped off, but it's not in the database in Chronometer. And the fat-soluble vitamins aren't topped off. And we look at minerals, a large portion of the mineral intake is hit, especially potassium, which is extremely important. So what you're seeing here is that just having fruits, which is high sugar foods, are also able to hit the micronutrient intake. Now, when we look at fiber, we have almost 30 grams of fiber from the fruits. We also have juice in this setup, so it could even be higher if you're using whole fruits. And then the polyunsaturated fat intake is 1.6 grams, with only 0.9 coming from omega-6. So when we look at this, it's a world of a difference to just say sugars. What we need to say is ultra-processed foods, or foods high in granulated sugar or granulated sugar, and those things do have problems if that is the majority of the diet. But when we look at something like fruits, we actually don't see these same problems. And again, I would argue that you'd actually see beneficial outcomes to changing the diet this way. And I see this with my clients directly, bringing fruit on board, whole fruits if you're dealing with metabolic issues, prediabetes, diabetes. And if you're somebody who's not, and who's athletic, active, or even you're sedentary, but you don't have any metabolic issues, you can incorporate juice in the diet without running into these same problems because of the fiber, because of the micronutrient content, and because of the polyphenolic plant compounds. So with that said, let's jump into the next clip, and let's see what Dr. Peter Attia has to talk about with the problems, or his main concern with eating sugars.
Does that mean that eating sugar in an unrestricted manner in a free living environment is of no consequence? No, it doesn't mean that at all. And it certainly appears that in at least a susceptible individual, a high consumption of fructose, and it seems even more clear in liquid fructose, can drive appetitive behavior. Meaning, to put that in English, if you're drinking a lot of sugar, it makes you want to eat more calories. Now, we can debate how many calories, and I believe that these data have been misrepresented. I think that these data have been misrepresented and overstated. Again, I think that in a free living environment, people will consume more energy if they have more access to sugar. But if you control for calories, and you may recall I had this discussion on the podcast with Rick Johnson using what I think was probably one of the most robust experiments I had seen on this topic, given how long it lasted. And my recollection was it lasted 9 months, which in mice is an eternity. Under isocaloric conditions, when these mice were fed, when their total calories were controlled, and you had high fructose versus low fructose groups, you did not see a statistically significant difference in body weight.
Okay. So a couple things. I do agree with Dr. T here that having access to ultra-processed foods or refined sugar sources in the form of liquids would make it hard to get enough satiety in a diet and would increase appetite and then lead to people overeating in terms of total amount of energy. That's true. However, I think everyone across the health sphere, whether they're low carb or whether they're higher carb, I would say on average would agree that incorporating high amounts of ultra-processed foods in the diet wouldn't actually be ideal. So the studies are testing pure fructose or pure sucrose, but I think the most pertinent question is, does eating sugar sources from fruits and from juices, which is what a lot of people, particularly in the bioenergetic sphere, would recommend, or in a higher carb intake, in an isocaloric setting, pose a health risk? I'd say overall, at worst, it doesn't, especially if, depending on the context, you have somebody with diabetes and fatty liver, they lend more towards whole food fruit sources or whole fruit sources over juices. Or if you have an athlete, they can have juices. And at best, there's actually a benefit to people's health for consuming these things. And the other thing is, when you set up a diet, even if you have fruit sources present or juice present, you can still have a high degree of satiety. Now, this is not to basically say that you need to not have fats and just have sugars. It's just to say that you can still incorporate liquid sugar sources in the form of juice and have satiety. And I know this personally because I do it every day, as well as doing this for my clients and also dialing in their total caloric intake across the day while allowing for satiety with these things. So I want to briefly show you how to do this, and then we'll jump into our last clip. So when we come into Chronometer, I have the same day that I had here before. And what we see is we have the banana cantaloupe orange juice, or we have banana pineapple orange juice for the carb source. So I'm going to leave these as the carb sources. And then what we can do is just easily add some protein sources into the meals here. So I'm going to keep it very simple just to show. So if you had steak or chicken into each meal, with the steak or chicken added into each meal, you're 4 ounces per meal. You're easily able to hit the protein target and you hit the carb target. And now it'll just be about bumping the fat target up, which could be very easy to do. So you can add something like macadamia nuts, and then possibly you could add something like avocado. And between these two, you would be able to bump the total intake up in terms of fats to organize the day while still having a high amount of sugars present and still being satiated. So when we put these in here, we're able to hit the protein target. We're able to keep the carb target the same. We have 40 grams of fiber in this day, and we still have 8 ounces of juice per each meal. And I bet you money, if you were to take this day and run this, you would have a high amount of satiety, especially if this was your specific caloric target. So if your caloric target was around 2,600 calories a day, if it's lower, you can adjust these amounts. But I set diets like this up all the time for clients, and I'm able to incorporate juice in their diet. Again, if somebody has diabetes or prediabetes, I'm looking to minimize the juice and use something more like whole fruits, or even incorporate tubers like potatoes or sweet potatoes or yams, and then still have the protein sources and still have fat sources, but still able to get adequate amounts of fiber that will provide satiety, adequate amounts of protein that will provide satiety, adequate amounts of fat that will also help to provide satiety, even though there's juice present. So I don't think it's a question of just whether or not you have liquid sugar in your diet. I think that simplifies it too much. I think if the full diet is adjusted appropriately, you can incorporate liquid sugar sources like juices, especially if you're not dealing with metabolic dysregulation, and still actually be able to have a pretty high level of satiety. And again, you're doing this in the context of making sure your calories are dialed in as well as your macros. And if you look at this diet, it's pretty nutrient dense overall. There's not really many gaps. There's really just vitamin D, E, and K, which is normal to be missed a bit on the diet unless you're incorporating dairy, and then also calcium. So unless you're incorporating dairy, and then when you remove seed oils, you see vitamin E tends to be low. And vitamin K, if we did hit it, would be largely K1 from adding in some cooked greens, which wouldn't change the macros very much at all. So you can indeed have satiety and micronutrient density on a diet like this. And we're going to see this last clip here, and that's why I'm bringing this up, because it'll lend into this discussion.
I would say the following, if I was going to try to sum this up. When I consume fructose, which I do all the time, it's generally in the form of fruit, right? Like, I don't restrict my consumption of fruit. I generally don't drink calories outside of protein shakes. Those happen to be sweetened with artificial sweeteners anyway these days. They're mostly like sucralose and things like that. if I'm drinking a beverage, like the once or twice a month that I want kind of a carbonated beverage that's sweet, it's a Diet Dr. Pepper as opposed to a Dr. Pepper. Okay. Would the Dr. Pepper kill me? No. But again, I'm only having like one a month, so it probably doesn't matter. But truthfully, Nick, that's more because of my teeth. Like what I really care more about is not putting an overall strain on my teeth than I do in the belief that sugar is somehow uniquely poisonous. So, I guess I do limit sugar intake. But what you're hearing me kind of react to is not because I think sugar is poison, but I think that sugar as part of I think a high sugar diet is just a dietary pattern that is incongruent with eating the right kinds of foods that I generally want to eat anyway. I hope that makes sense and it's not too waffly.
Okay, so first things first, we hear a low carb diet advocate saying that he eats fructose all the time. To be fair, it is in the form of fruit, but this is a shift from what we've seen from low carb diet doctors and gurus over time. We're starting to see a lot of them are starting to say, hey, we actually have fruit in our diet. We actually have carbs in our diet. Maybe we have high carb days and low carb days. And so we're seeing this slow trend and shift. I've talked about that with Dave Asprey. I've talked about that in videos looking or discussing and briefly mentioning it with people like Dr. Paul Saladino. Again, I don't think this is a bad thing. I don't knock them for doing these types of shifts. I'm just saying we're seeing these people start to say, hey, look, maybe these carbs aren't so much of a problem. And this is kind of the same trend that I went through when I first went low carb. And then I was like, okay, I'm doing pretty well for certain reasons. I have videos discussing, why I quit low carb and some of the things I experienced. You could check that out on my channel. But basically, I went through this progression. I was in low carb. I developed issues and I started to add carbs back in, looking through this new bioenergetic lens and starting to understand the differences and starting to look in the research and say, hey, maybe there's not that much of a problem with carbs. And maybe there's certain contexts where I want to use different carbs versus other types of carbs and structure a diet from there. And now this is what I'm doing with many clients on a regular basis because people are going through the same transition and these doctors are going through the same transition as the data comes out or as they start to look at the data. And so I think this is helpful overall. This isn't to knock Dr. Peter Attia. It's just kind of shocking because he was a low carb, keto and intermittent fasting advocate for quite some time. And there's a pretty big change in his tune. Now, something here I do disagree with is he says a high sugar diet is a dietary pattern that is incongruent with eating the right kinds of foods that he generally wants to eat anyway. So actually, I disagree with this very directly because you can still have a high sugar diet and you can still have a nutrient dense diet and you can still have health with a high sugar diet. It just depends on how it's set up. And the other thing is the alternative would be a high fat diet. And how you go about that drastically changes this nutrient profile. So I want to take a peek at that before we wrap up the video. So let's jump into Chronometer again. Okay, so what I have set up here is we have 3 different fat sources that are often incorporated on a keto diet. And then we have 3 different juice sources that are often incorporated in a higher carb or a bioenergetic type setup. Now, the reason I use juices over whole fruits is because I wanted to kind of match the idea that we would have a relatively refined carbohydrate source that somebody would incorporate in their diet realistically instead of granulated sugar and maple syrup. I don't think it's a good idea to structure your diet around those things. Again, lack of vitamins and minerals, lack of fibers, and also lack of the polyphenolic compounds. So juices, I think, is like the best option as a comparison point. That's how I'm kind of choosing things. And then I chose these fat sources because these are the major fat sources that I'm seeing with clients on a regular basis who are coming from a high fat diet, a keto diet, or carnivore diet. These are the major choices that they're running with. So what I did was I organized each of these fat sources so that they're each around 500 calories, and then the carb sources are each around 500 calories. So we're going to be comparing the carbs and fat sources for their nutrient content based on an equivalency of 500 calories. So we look at butter. 500 calories of butter basically just gives you some vitamin A and salt, which is added, so not really any nutrition. When we look at olive oil, you really just have a little bit of vitamin E and a little bit of vitamin K, so nothing else. And when we look at beef tallow, there's actually not really any nutrition present in beef tallow besides the fat. So all 3 of them, pretty nutrient poor overall. So if you're going to structure your diet and you're going to look for sources that are going to be congruent with a healthy diet, you would want micronutrient density, and arguably you would want the plant compounds, the polyphenolic compounds. So the fats, micronutrient density is low, and then also lacks polyphenolic compounds. But when we look at something like the juices, orange juice for 500 calories, quite nutrient dense. We're topping off quite a few B vitamins. We're hitting the vitamin C target 6 times over the DRI. We're also hitting quite a few minerals as well. We're almost half of the DRI, daily recommended intake for potassium. So orange juice, pretty nutrient dense, while providing carbohydrate, which would be an energy source. Because again, the debate is whether you use carbs or fats for an energy source. Now, in terms of grape juice, we see not as nutrient dense as something like orange juice. It's a little bit lower in the B vitamins, but it has a pretty decent amount of different minerals like magnesium, iron, manganese, and potassium, which is still significantly better than the fat sources. The last one would be pineapple juice. We see it does have some B vitamins. It has some folate and some vitamin C, and also has a decent mineral intake for copper, manganese, and then also potassium. So significantly more nutrient dense than the fat sources, not to mention the plant polyphenolic compounds. And also there's some discussion, and I've made videos about this on my Mike Fave Science channel, talking about the differences between carb oxidation and fat oxidation, and looking the negative effects of fat oxidation in terms of creating stress in the mitochondria over the long term. So I would recommend checking those out if you're interested in that. But in general, there's a lot of reasons I think to incorporate carbs in a diet. And also you can incorporate sugar sources that still create a nutrient-dense diet with a lot of benefits without the downsides that you would see if you had a high-fat diet where you don't have that same nutrient density, because these things, butter, olive oil, and beef tallow don't have that much nutrient density. And again, this isn't to say that you can't have these fats in the diet or juices in the diet. You can have both. It's a question of how much do you have to hit the specific targets. And also, it's not to say that you need to be plant-based or animal-based. It's to say, at this point, we know that carbs have beneficial effects on hormones. They're also helpful to lower stress. They're also helpful for how they function in mitochondria. There's benefits to the nutrients we can get from some of these carb sources, but there's also benefits to these fat sources. We also need fat in the diet. We also need protein. So it's how do we structure a diet to hit these different targets? And again, if we go back to this example day, you can have a diet high in sugar and you can still incorporate steak and chicken and also fat sources. You could switch out the macadamia nuts or the avocados here and add in some butter with the steak or beef tallow or olive oil. All of those are fine to hit the target. It's not an either or question. It's just to say here that I think you can actually have a diet high in sugar that is compatible with health, that is nutrient dense, and that won't ruin your satiety so that you're eating an unlimited amount of calories on a regular basis. And it's just how you set that up. And I think fruits, whole fruits, juices are a good way to go about that. And to be fair here, Dr. Peter Attia is saying, hey, I have fruit in my diet on a regular basis, which again, I would agree with him. I think that's fine. Now, taking all of this into consideration, if you're curious about which carb sources you can start to implement in your diet, I have a video that you can check out on my channel. And then also, you can go to my website at mikefave.com and pick up the Nutrition Blueprint PDF and video course that walks you through setting up a diet so that you can maintain an isocaloric, high sugar diet. So that wraps up this video. If you want to hear any more videos like this, please leave comments in the section below, and I'll catch you in the next video.